Item 10E, receive a quarterly financial report as of September 2010 for the 2010-2011 General Fund, Special Revenue Funds, Enterprise Funds budget.
Money? You got money?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. This item is to review the first quarter results for the general fund, special revenue funds, internal service funds, and the enterprise funds of the city. We begin with the general fund. Through the first quarter, revenues are at 16% of budget, or $4.9 million. This is comparable to the same level that we had in the prior year. One of the primary reasons that revenues are not exactly 25% is that there's seasonalities in revenues. For instance, property tax is one of the major revenues in which we don't receive the revenues until the latter part of the calendar year. The first installment is not due from the county, for instance, until December, and the second installment until April, May. So I'll go over some of the key revenues, the larger revenues for the general fund. I'll start with property taxes. As I mentioned earlier, these are received during the latter part of the fiscal year, and currently through the first quarter we're only at 1%, but that's really comparable to what we expect on a fiscal year basis. We did get information from the county in terms of revenue estimates for the city of San Bruno, and our budgets are very comparable to that level, so I do expect that at the end of the fiscal year we'll be very close in meeting the budgeted targets for property taxes. Next, we'll go to sales tax. Sales tax is the second largest general fund revenue category, and through the first 3 months, we're at 9% of the budget. Now, this only includes the first month of revenues. Sales taxes are traditionally received in arrears, with estimates based on prior year's levels and adjustments based on states' estimates of growth or negative growth, for that matter. We did receive some positive news from our sales tax consultants in the last quarter. Sales tax revenues were up around 4.7% compared to the same period of the prior year. So while one quarter does not really make the trends, certainly it's a positive sign for the city. And since I'm talking about positive signs, another element or another category of revenues that's showing some positive growth is in the area of TOT tax. One of the better measurements in terms of the health, in terms of revenue health for the city is TOT, because we get those revenues on a monthly basis. As the hotel properties, motel properties receive the TOT taxes that they collect, the city is remitted those amounts 1 month in arrears, so it's a good barometer in terms of how things are going. And in terms of TOT revenues, even though it's not in the top 5 category, we're seeing in excess of 30% growth. Now, some of that growth is contributed by the fact that we increased TOT rate from 10% to 12% back in November of 2009. However, even if I shave that off, we still do see positive growth in that area. So again, some positive signs. But I want to reemphasize a little bit of a caveat. 2 months of TOT revenues doesn't really tell us we're going to be able to hit revenue targets for the entire general fund at the conclusion of the 12-month period. I'll move on to the next largest category, which is actually I'm not moving along in here. Next largest category is vehicle license fee. Most of the vehicle license fee is actually an in lieu payment paid with property tax, and therefore we're seeing a very small amount through the first 3 months, and again, we'll see that money when we get the property tax revenues come December. Majority of that $3.3 million is in lieu money there. Next category is charges for services. What those are primarily cost allocations to the various departments and the various funds. And then a smaller portion of that is really the billing services that we provide for the garbage services there. So we're right at the 25% level for the 3-month period. And the last of the larger categories in terms of general funds is use of money and property. That includes investment earnings from our investment portfolio. And it also includes the equity earnings from our cable TV operations. In terms of investment earnings, we're seeing some challenges in terms of potentially meeting that target, only from the perspective that the Federal Reserve continues to support growth in the economy by pushing down interest rates and buying back treasuries. That way, what that does is actually drives down interest rates in the marketplace, and therefore the investments that we make, whether it's buying bonds out there in the open market or investing in Lake and or the San Mateo County pool, those the interest earnings on those are getting pressured as rates in the overall climate continue to decline. And then move into the top 5, if I may, on the departmental revenues. And these include police services, primarily from traffic fines that we have, and also reimbursements from, there's actually a grant that we get from the state for $100,000, and then we also get some Prop 172 money from sales tax. So that's the primary contributor in terms of police. And as you can tell by the slide, we're very comparable to the same level we had last year, $242,000 versus $232 from the prior year. Next largest category for departmental revenues is from the community services department. That includes our recreation, senior centers, and parks. And we're a little bit ahead in terms of revenue dollars, $23,000 higher than we were previously, and we're at 31% of budget. Obviously, there's some seasonality in terms of that department. With the summer, there's recreation programs and aquatic programs, and therefore a little bit higher revenues than a 25% calculation there. Next category is for engineering and streets, and those are really from gas tax, primarily from the gas tax that the state pays us, and from encroachment permit fees that we have. And that's right at the 25% mark, and coming in kind of on target there. Next category is from the planning and building departments, and those are primarily building and inspection fees. There are no large projects that we've projected in for this category of revenues, as we were obviously very conservative in building our budgets, and looking at the dollar amounts were again pretty comparable to the last year's level, 187 versus 175. And lastly, in terms of departmental revenues, is from the fire department. Those are really from fire inspection fees that we collect, and much of that is actually built into the business license renewal process, and therefore you see a very high amount in terms of percentage of budget, because the business license renewals takes place at the beginning of the fiscal year. I'll move on to expenditures for the general fund. As you can tell, as I mentioned earlier also, we're at 24% of the total expenditure budget. We're about $7.5 million compared to the overall budget of about $31.4 million. Everything is really coming in within the budget. There's a couple of departments that are a little bit higher, and really it's, again, because of the seasonality of the expenditures. So for instance, in terms of engineering and streets, we made a payment for CCAG for $139,000. That's the full year assessment, and so that's pushes the total expenditures up a little bit. The library includes annual payment for the Peninsula Library System for our share costs, so that drives up that department's cost a little bit. But again, overall, we're within the targeted levels. One of the things that the city is obviously mindful of is obviously the Glenfield fire. We're continuing to incur costs for that incident, and obviously we're working hard also to compile the cost for reimbursement from the state and the federal government, mindful of the fact that there potentially would be some costs of the city we're not able to fully recover from all the available resources out there. I'll move on to special revenue funds, and that's primarily the redevelopment agency. Again, the anomaly in terms of revenues for both the operating fund and the low and moderate income fund is really from the fact that the revenues are from the tax increment that's generated from the property tax bills, and therefore we don't see those revenues until, again, the latter part of the calendar year and April, May of the following year. In terms of expenditures, obviously within targets with those levels. We'll move into onto the internal service funds. There are primarily 4 internal service funds: the self-insurance, the building facility maintenance, garage, and the technology. Because these are internal service funds, accounting-wise, we just charge them proratably, and therefore it's at 25% of all the revenue categories. The only anomaly in terms of expenses is in the self-insurance. That's because we pay the insurance premiums up front in July, and therefore there's that spike in the beginning of the year. I'll move on to the enterprise funds. 4 major enterprise funds: cable television, wastewater, water, and the stormwater funds. And again, looking at the overall percentages, they're all in line. And again, with some of the other revenues I talked about earlier, the stormwater assessments is actually part of the property tax bills, and therefore no dollars have been received, and we don't expect that out again until the December month when we get our property tax revenues from the county. With that, I'll take any questions. This is an informational report. Any questions that the City Council has, I'll take them right now.
Any questions? Michael?
I noticed that you were using as a baseline for last year the initial approved budget, not the budget that we ended up with at the end of the year. And that budget was a lot larger, which would mean the percentages would be smaller.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we were to look at that, it kind of makes it look like if we're looking percentage-wise the same as last year, we're actually doing not so good, because we know that last year those percentages I mean, they didn't work out at the end of the year. And knowing what we know about, well, I mean, we can estimate, we can imagine what the costs related to the Glenview fire are going to be. So we know that there's a variance there that we need to account for. We know last year that we had one-time contributions to the budget that aren't going to be there this year, or probably aren't going to be there this year. So given all that, it sounds like we're probably not in great shape.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, again, it's only 1 quarter worth of results. While there are some positive signs in terms of revenues that I talked about, it's still important for staff to continue to monitor our expenses and make sure that, you know, we're spending within our limits there. You know, Glenview continues to be a major concern for us. There's a lot of expenditures and a lot of work to be done for that particular incident, and so I'm certainly not conveying to the City Council that, you know, we're out of the woods by any means in terms of what's going on. Overall economy and unemployment is still very, very high. There are some economists out there that are thinking that the unemployment rate is going to remain high until 2014 because, you know, there are just not enough signs from the experts that tell us that, you know, there's going to be a lot of, you know, rapid growth overall. So it's certainly something that I myself am very conscientious of, and even though you know, we're into October, I mean, we're actually not that far away from starting to think about the next year's budgets and any significant adjustments that, you know, we may have to account for between now and, you know, January of next year, when we meet again to talk about, you know, the results of the 6 months period. So your point is well taken in terms of, you know, continue to monitor the situation for both revenues and expenditures.
Okay.
Any other questions? Irene?
Thank you. Are we keeping track, or you, keeping track of all the Glenview fire expenditures in a separate accounting system?
Yes.
Or is it, okay.
Yes, we created a special fund, the Emergency Disaster Fund, specifically for that purpose, so that we can monitor all the costs associated with the incident, with the disaster.
Okay. So say in January, might we hear a report about that too and how it affects everything, or is that too soon?
We can certainly include that as part of our report to the City Council in January, to give you an update on what the expenditures are for that particular fund for the disaster.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I, for one, would like to see that. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.